In section 2, we're going to look at the modern evolutionary classification. And the starter question is to explain why the classification of the American vulture has changed. So we have 3 learning objectives, learning targets. We're going to look at the difference between the evolutionary classification and Linnaeus's classification system. We're going to look at a cladogram, and then we will look at how DNA is used in classification. So first we're going to take a look at evolutionary classification, and this is Darwin's idea, going back to that single tree of life, suggesting a new way to classify organisms that is not just based on their similarities and differences, but also their evolutionary relationships as well. And using this system, then the taxa will be grouped according to how closely related they are. So this is just kind of looking at dinosaurs and the different taxa that are part of them. When we look at phylogeny, it is the evolutionary history of the lineages. So it's also known as evolutionary classification. So it will group species into larger categories that are looking at evolutionary descent. And this is kind of what we are seeing in this picture. We are looking at this larger evolutionary descent from dinosaurs. So you can see how modern birds and crocodiles fall into play here. Cladograms are groups or visual representations that will show how groups of organisms have evolved. So it looks at the lineages and how they branched off from common ancestors. So we're going to take a look at this. In this first picture, you can see the purple where they had shared a common ancestor, and then you could see where they started splitting into different groups of organisms or taxa. In this case, in the second picture, we are showing how that common ancestor led to many descendants, and it's showing 4 groups of descendants. And so in this part, the lineages 3 and 4 are sharing a common ancestor more recently with each other than they do with lineage 2. And then you can see that lineage 3 and 4 are more closely related than they would be to 1 or 2. And in this third picture here, we are looking at the evolutionary relationships amongst vertebrates. And vertebrates are defined as animals that have backbones. So these are cladograms or graphic representations that are looking at different groups of organisms and how they shared common ancestors. We're going to look at derived characters. These are traits that arose in the most common ancestor when we look at a particular grouping or lineage and then was passed on to those descendants. And these are used in cladograms to look at the lineage groups. So in this case, when we look at derived characters, we could define hair, forelimbs, retractable claws, and specialized sharp teeth, where these are derived characters for the grouping of cats. Specifically, just looking at the retractable claws, because those are unique just to the cat family, or the cat grouping, Felidae. So when we interpret a cladogram, a clade is considered a single common ancestor that all the groups have descended from. So this is looking at these different clades. And then you can see these areas, they're called nodes. It's a point at which 2 of the groups will branch off from each other. And it is the last point at which those common groups shared a common ancestor. And you can see that there are different derived characters that are shared by only members of a clade. So for example, looking at this one, we see the amphibians, and we see that after the presence of 4 limbs, all of these particular organisms have 4 limbs. But then you see the amniotic egg. And so when we look at the amniotic egg, this is something that's unique to the reptiles, the marsupials, the dogs, and the cats, but not to the amphibians. Hair is something that is unique to the marsupials, the dogs, and the cats, and not the reptiles and the amphibians, where the dogs have the shearing teeth that is unique to the dogs and the cats, but not the other organisms, and then the retractable claws are unique just to the cat group. So when we look at the clades and the traditional taxonomic groups, a true clade is going to be monophyletic, which means that it will contain an ancestral species and all of its descendants and not leave anything out. So when we look at these, when we're looking at the reptiles, this is not considered a clade because it has left some organisms out. Here we could see the aves or the birds and then the reptiles. So how do lizards and snakes form a clade? Or do lizards and snakes form a clade? Yes, because you can kind of snip above the node where the lizards off from the crocodiles and the birds in order to get a tree of only the snakes and the lizards. We can also use DNA classification in order to analyze the ancestors by comparing different forms of the genes that are found in each of the species. These are a newer development, and so this is not something that was available for quite some time, but more recently has been. So in this case, we see the hooded vulture and the American vulture. And for the longest time, it was believed that the two vultures were very closely related. Yet after the molecular analysis from the DNA, the American vultures are actually more similar to the storks than the DNA of the African vultures. And so again, it was thought to be the opposite, that the two vultures were more closely related until they analyzed the DNA. So the DNA of the storks and the American vulture are very similar. The hooded vulture is also known as the African vulture. So next we're going to look at cladistics and these particular organisms. Again, looking at the DNA, the giant panda is actually more closely related to the bear, and that the red panda is more closely related to the raccoon. So giant pandas and red pandas share a lot of anatomical similarities with both the bears and the raccoons, and both of these are going to have specific wrist bones that work like a human thumb. But after looking at the DNA, the giant panda is going to share more in common with the bear and have a more recent common ancestor with the bear than it would the raccoon. This is looking at a data table that is then made into a cladogram. So in this case, you could see how mosses do not have vascular tissue, seeds, or flowers. So mosses tend to be more of a primitive plant that then gave rise to the other organisms. Ferns have vascular tissue, so we know that after the mosses, then the ferns would be the next group that have existed. And you can see that after the mosses, every other plant has had vascular tissue. So when we look at those derived characteristics, the hardened vascular tissue appeared after the mosses. So every plant after that will have that particular trait. After the ferns, then the seeds were a derived character, and both the groupings after the ferns have those particular traits. So the conifers and the flowering plants both have seeds, and yet the only group that has flowers would be the flowering plants, and so they came after the conifers. This is an example for you guys to try taking this particular table and making it kind of fitting it into this particular cladogram, where the numbers are going to represent the organisms and the letters will represent the derived characters or characteristics.